Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here in Washington, D.C. at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and we have with us Dr. Michael Green, who is the Chair for Japan and Asia Studies here. Michael, thanks for joining us.
Sure. Thank you.
Obviously, we talked a couple of weeks ago in a very, very interesting interview, but your book is now out. Tell us a little bit about the premise of the book and what you're trying to achieve with it.
It's from Columbia University Press, and the title is By More Than Providence, Grand Strategy and American Power in the Asia-Pacific since 1783. I started this after I left the National Security Council in the Bush administration, where I was the senior Asia person and wrote a lot of what we called strategery. And I came out and I wanted to know where all these ideas came from. I mean, my pen, but there was more to it than that. So I started looking back, and in 1783, Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter to Colonel George Rogers Clark on the frontier fighting the British and the Native Americans, warning that the British were preparing to send an expedition to what is today Oregon, and we couldn't let them do that without countering them. So I start with that because the whole through line of the book is that we have always engaged, in the end, when forced to, with balance of power strategies. We've had strategies, and as I went through and looked at the writings of John Quincy Adams, of Alfred Thayer Mahan, Kennan, these themes kept repeating about offshore balancing, about trade. And the bottom line, in a way, for us is, in America, we've been successful when we've combined a strong defense, trade, and diplomatic engagement and balance of power strategies. And when we've cared about democracy, because in the long run, democratic states are more open and reliable. But also for our Asian friends, a bit of a message that don't get Uncle Sam's backup, because we may look complacent, as we did before Pearl Harbor or before Korea. But whenever the U.S. is challenged in Asia, we tend to strengthen our alliances, strengthen our defense, expand our position. So lessons for everyone in the book, I hope. Lots of good pictures and a few little officially declassified tidbits from the Bush and Clinton and Obama administrations.
So you know that I'm a big fan of strategery, but what were some? I mean, that is a really action-packed. I mean, obviously coinciding with U.S. history, but obviously from a world history standpoint, it was a very action-packed period. What are some of those fascinating nuggets that you dug up by going through some of these original source materials as a reformed journalist, but still a scholar? What were some of the things that you gleaned from there that was like, holy crap, man, that's really interesting?
Well, as a one-time journalist, I found that so many of the characters who, in a way, were just bureaucrats or Navy captains or missionaries are so fascinating. So John Ledyard, the Dartmouth guy who dropped out his sophomore year and joined the Royal Marines, traveled around the world with Captain Cook, came back and told Jefferson and other founding fathers about Hawaii, about the Pacific Northwest, about trade with China. And the first year after the revolution ended, the Empress of China set sail from New York and made a 400% profit with ginseng from Pennsylvania, trading with Canton. Or the links, you've probably studied Alfred Thayer Mahan. Mm-hmm. But Alfred Thayer Mahan was very much influenced by Commodore Perry, who had opened up Japan, who came back and gave a series of strategic speeches in New York about Japan, the island chain, forward presence, all concepts that came back a century later and were championed by people like George F. Kennan in the Cold War. So the continuity of the debates and the themes, but also the kind of lineage of the maritime strategic thinkers since 1815, going all the way to people like Armitage today, or the continentalists beginning in the 1850s with missionaries and diplomats in China, going through John Hay's Open Door Notes, Kissinger, Brzezinski, and the idea that China is the center of our Asia strategy. Is it Japan or China? It's both in a way, but these debates go back over a century. So that was great fun, and so there's a bit of a story there about these characters and how they picked up this debate, carried it forward, and how it's still with us.
And what was the all-time character before I then go back to a serious question?
John Ledyard in the 1770s and 80s definitely gets a lot of credit for being a character. I mean, I don't know what you did on your spring break in college, but I didn't chop down a tree, canoe down the Connecticut River, and join the Royal Marines. Maybe you did. So he's definitely a character. The other one I really like is Pete Ellis, a Marine Corps major who traveled around the South Pacific drunk most of the time, spying on what the Japanese were doing in the former German mandates in places that the U.S. Marine Corps in World War II fought bloody battles to retake, Tarawa, Saipan, and so forth. He died mysteriously on one of those islands. They found him the next morning, dead, with 2 bottles of whiskey provided to him by the Japanese defense attaché. So there are lots of things in there. There's an interview with Zbigniew Brzezinski where he talks about what Deng Xiaoping really said to Jimmy Carter as they were normalizing. Carter was trying to talk Deng out of fighting a war with the Soviets. Brzezinski wasn't so troubled by that and enjoyed watching Deng play with Carter. Carter said, you shouldn't provoke the Soviets, you'll have a massive nuclear war. And Deng said, how many casualties do you think we'll take? And the answer was, oh my God, it could be tens of millions, hundreds of millions. And Deng said, we have plenty of people. So the way that personalities sort of took these big strategic questions and made mischief with them was also fun. And Deng definitely is in there. And in modern times, you have some really interesting, fun characters. Rich Armitage, Kurt Campbell, friends of ours.
Yeah.
I come across in the book a little bit but just as a basically boring bureaucrat and historian.
I wouldn't endorse that. I find you're quite the raconteur, and you know.
I'm the scribe and a witness to some of it. So it is very heavily footnoted. I went through a lot of archives. Having been a practitioner, I wanted to be sure I was really doing the best scholarship possible to tell the story.
There are fewer table dancing stories involving you than some other members, some other people you just recently mentioned. But let me take you to something. Mahan, yes. Well, I have no idea what his dancing skills were like, but
He wasn't much of a sailor, actually. He was more of a desk sailor. I have no idea if he was good at table dancing.
We do know that Kurt Campbell, however, is good at that.
I couldn't find any archival evidence, so it's not in the book.
So let me take you to strategery again. You just got back from China. You were in Hong Kong, and where else was on your?
I was
tour?
in Japan as well.
You were in Japan as well. Talk to us a little bit about how the new administration is seen. You've had certainly some criticism, on that front as well. Where do you, what is the view of the region of the new president, and what do you think are some of the things that, when we last talked, it was before Prime Minister Abe and Trump met, President Trump met. It's also been, Tillerson is now over in the region right now. Talk to us a little bit about both how the region sees the United States and some of the things the United States has to do to be successful with the region.
Well, as a candidate, Donald Trump was like certain members of my fraternity, I remember, who were as shocking and appalling as possible to everyone else on campus. And as a candidate, Donald Trump pretty much ruined everyone's day, whether they were allies or a country like China, which is somewhere between competitor and partner. He threatened to take away the 2 fundamental pillars of our leadership in Asia and stability in Asia that I chronicle in part of my book, our alliances set up in 1951 in San Francisco, the underpinning of which is our security commitment, and secondly, the one China policy, the idea that we're going to work with China, that that we switch recognition from Taiwan to China in '79. Controversial, but every president since has honored that. And Mr. Trump said, as a candidate, they're both on the table. And I guess this is how you negotiate casino deals and things in his business. You can't do strategy that way. You can't take on everyone. He's shifted. He's now reaffirmed with Mr. Abe in person in the press conference in March, in late February, that we will defend Japan, including in the Senkaku, the areas that China claims. And he said to Xi Jinping that same week on the phone, we're not changing our one China policy. So that's reassuring, but there's still a lot of questions that our allies, China, have, and I heard many of them when I was in Beijing and Tokyo. They liked Mattis in the Allied camp. Japan, Korea really appreciated his visit. And they recognize U.S. defense spending is going up, which they see as a big plus. Mm-hmm. So pretty good on that front. They don't worry too much about Trump administration going soft on North Korea or China. And they did worry about that with Obama. So that part's generally good. They worry about the lack of an economic strategy. The president pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, on day one. There's no apparent interest, in fact, some hostility in the administration to a bilateral investment treaty with China, which U.S. business sees as critical. It's not even clear if the president's going to go to the summit in the fall for APEC, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation grouping. Big vacuum there. And, you know, one of the things my history shows is you can have the greatest military strategy in the world. If you're not engaged in business and opening markets and making rules, you know, the system will tilt and you will have to use your military option, which you don't want. You got to shape the region. And economically, we're not doing that right now. Our businesses are, but the administration doesn't have a plan and will have to come up with something. And then diplomacy. And, you know, the Japanese and Chinese official scholars, the Koreans, they see an epic battle in Washington between the mercantilists and the ideologues, mostly in the White House, and then the sort of more normal Republicans they see in the cabinet, like Mattis and Tillerson and also Vice President Pence. I'm sure people in the administration would say there's no fight, we're all on the same page, but there's a pretty big difference in the worldview of some of those people. Right. And Secretary Tillerson's now out in the region. You know, the Japanese and Chinese don't agree on much, but I think they both agree they want him to prevail. They want him to be an important player.
Let me ask you two things, because I know your time is very, very short. But thing number one is, how does she, and we talked to Bonnie Glaser about this, so both of these interviews will be up roughly at the same time, but for Xi, this is the 19th Party Congress. This is a very, very big deal. We're looking at a new Politburo, and Xi has faced some challenges. Economic growth has softened. There's been some criticism of his leadership. He is a nationalist. How do you think that relationship plays with this administration ultimately? Is he going to be more malleable, as some people in Washington think, or is he likely to be less malleable in some ways because he's feeling that, you know, China doesn't back down? You know, I'm a leader that's going to push this forward, for example.
I think Chinese officials, Chinese leaders, and Chinese academics recognize that they're not going to get away with some of the stuff they got away with under the Obama administration with President Trump. I mean, I'm not a huge fan of his theory of, you know, chaos and unpredictability, but the one advantage it does have is he has back-footed our friends in Beijing, and they are not going to assume that they can get things out of him that they got out of President Obama, like the new model of great power relations, this concept that U.S. and China are the two most important players in Asia, which obviously demoted our allies. That kind of stuff. That kind of sort of pleading for reassurance and stability, they're not going to get that out of the Trump administration. That's probably a good thing. On the other hand, they hear talk of 45% tariffs, of major arms sales to Taiwan, of all kinds of things that, you know, are not China's version of the one China policy. They're ours. So they see friction too. So they're watching very carefully. The 19th Party Congress is not like an election. The U.S. election, the nationalism goes up. In the 19th Party Congress, because of the domestic work that she has to do to reconstitute the Standing Committee of the Politburo and take on reform of the PLA and other big items, he's actually going to be a little more careful, I think, externally, unless he gets pushed to the point where he has to demonstrate he's a tough guy. So for now, the Chinese are sending tough signals. You know, internally, they've been saying, it is reported, they won't swing the first blow, but if Trump swings, they're going to hit twice as hard. And the Premier Li Keqiang says, we don't want a trade war, but if the U.S. starts a trade war, we will win. So that kind of tough talk, but in fact, being very careful with the administration. I think that's the tone they're setting through the end of the year.
And let me ask, yes, and on foreign aid.
I do have to go.
And let me ask you one last question on foreign aid. Obviously, that budget has taken a big hit. You talked about an integrated strategy, and America's been most successful when it's had an integrated strategy. What do you think the impact will be of a vastly diminished foreign aid, as opposed to looking, putting all the money into the military side of things, which folks say, if you've got a hammer, all your problems look like nails.
That's it. I mean, Ash Carter famously said passing the Trans-Pacific Partnership would be worth an aircraft carrier to him. And one of the lessons of history is when we disengage economically and diplomatically in the region, the possibility of military confrontation goes up. So the amount of money we're spending on the military, which I think is needed, would pale in comparison to what we'd have to do if we had a real conflict. So it's a good investment, and so many Republicans on the Hill know this, that I think they will prevail in putting back a good chunk of the development and diplomatic budget that the White House has taken away.